There's just a couple more slides that we didn't get to do last week, so we'll get to those in a minute. But turn to page 1 of the study guide. This is a course on choosing a Bible version. And we're going to be, I read the first part of the introduction to you last week, but I want to talk about how the study will comprise the following parts right there in the middle of the page. There are 8 parts to this study. Part 1 is going to be a brief history of the Hebrew and Greek text. This is the history of how the text came to be and how they have been transmitted down through the centuries to us today. And then part 2 is going to be a history of the Greek New Testament text of Desiderius Erasmus. How many of you know who Desiderius Erasmus is? Nope. Okay, you will when we get done. Important guy. And to go to slide 28. And this is the text, the Greek text that Desiderius Erasmus used for all English versions of the 16th and 18th century. And this study guide is an adaptation of an article entitled Erasmus and the Search for the Original Text of the New Testament by Martin Heide in this year. Part 3 is what is involved in translating the text. How many of you know what's involved in translating a text into English? Not many of us, right? You'll know something about it, at least enough to appreciate the work involved in doing it. And that's an adaptation of an article entitled 5 Decisions Every Bible Translator Must Make by Peter J. Gurry, and this was a couple years ago. And then part 4 will be English versions before King James the First, an adaptation of part 1 of a lecture given by Dr. Daniel Wallace at the Lancaster Bible College in 2001. And part 5 will be the history of the King James Version of 1611. How many of you know the history of the creation of the King James Version of the Bible? And then you came in one part of the thing and something came out at the other end, right? That's all you know about it. Okay, well, you'll learn more about it. I think if we're going to use a Bible version, you ought to know something about how it came to be. And so we'll look at that. It's a very interesting history. Part 6 is English versions after 1611 to 1881. This is an adaptation of part 3 of the same lecture by Dr. Wallace. And part 7 is modern English versions after 1881. This is also an adaptation of part 4 of that same lecture. And then finally we get to part 8, after we have a lot of background and some understanding of what it takes to get a Bible version. Then we're going to be talking about how to choose an English version. And then I passed out a chart. You all have your chart? This is the color chart. Did you get one of those? You got that with you? This one here. You got an extra one? I have an extra one. Would you like to come get it? Oh. Brother Krause, did you get one of these? You have it at home. Okay. I'll give you one to share, just so that you can follow along. Give that to Joyce. Anybody else need one? Okay. Okay, let's go to slide 28. All right. Is that 28? Go back 1. Go back 2. Keep going. Okay, go forward now. All right, we're in the right place. Go to slide 28. Just go to the next one. We're there. Okay. When you look at the chart, let's look at the chart for a second. And we're going to go over the chart in greater detail at part 8. But I handed it out early because I would hope that you would look at it and try to understand what the chart is all about, so that when we get to it, you're already familiarized yourself with what it contains. But there's something interesting in the third column called type. If you look at the third column called type, there are four types of versions or translations. There's what's called the formal equivalent. If you see the word form there, if you go down, it explains formal equivalent translation that tends to mimic the forms, word choice, word order, grammatical category of the Hebrew and Greek, even when this causes awkward English. Sometimes it's called a word-for-word type of translation. Then the next one you see is dyna, that's dynamic equivalency. You look down, the definition is dynamic equivalent translations try to find an optimal blend of formal and functional translation choices. But what we're not familiar with most of all is this idea of a functional equivalent, functional equivalence. And you see that there are some Bibles that are orange in the orange section that are functional equivalents. And a functional equivalent translation work to choose renderings that achieve the same function for today's readers that the original text would have had in their for their first readers, even if this means introducing more interpretation than might be strictly necessary. That's what I call a functional equivalent. Now, the King James is noted to be a formal equivalent translation, a word-for-word type of translation. But even the King James has some functional equivalent verses in it, or translation in it. And this is an example up here in Luke chapter 2, verse 1. We all know this verse. We could probably recite it from memory. And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And the word taxed is in bold. Now, what you may not know, unless you know the Greek New Testament, is that the word translated tax is not the word for taxed. It's a different word. So go to the next slide. So the answer, and here's the Greek word, it means to be enrolled, a census. So if they translated it, the Greek word, then it says, Caesar Augustus sent out a decree that all the world should be counted or made into a census. The reason for the census, of course, was so that he could tax them. And so that's a functional equivalent. So the translator said, we'll put tax in there because that was the ultimate purpose for the census. His goal was eventually to tax the people, but the Greek word that's in the text means to enroll or to register. It's kind of like registering to vote. It's in view of the vote or casting a vote, but we register beforehand. So that's just an example of what is meant by a functional equivalent. You understand the function? The function is to be taxed, but the word really means to be enrolled or registered. Y'all get that? Okay. Let's go to the next slide. Now, last week I gave you a bunch of what I call false friends. These are words in the King James, English words that we still use today, but the meaning has changed considerably in the last 400 years. That's what a false friend is. And what was my point for calling attention to these things? Do you remember? I'll have to repeat it 7 more times, I'm sure. Y'all remember what my point was? My point was the King James Version of the Bible is an excellent translation. It was an accurate translation when it was done, and it's still accurate if you understand 16th century, 17th century English. And the false friends demonstrate that if you're going to continue to use the King James Version, there's nothing wrong with using it. I still use it. I love it. I've memorized a good deal of it. But if you're going to use the King James, and particularly if you're teaching people, then you need to know what the words mean. All right, and here's the last example. This is one of my favorite ones. Incidentally, a lot of these things don't really change doctrine any, but people get confused when they look at words that they don't understand today. And our English has changed in the last 400 years. And heck, our English has changed in the last 50 years. Okay, so here's a real important, not an important one here, but here's one of my favorites. This is in 1 Samuel chapter 27. And Achish. Now, Achish is a Philistine king. And he says to David, "Whither have you made a road today?" And the word road is the one that is in question here. What does the road mean? A path. Any other guesses? I think everybody would understand that today road means a path or a street or a way. And so that's the question he asked David. Whither have you made a road today? Now this is an illustration of how important context is to get the meaning of the word. So let's go to the next slide and we'll get some context. In the following verse, David said, "Against the south of Judah and against the south of the Jerahmeelites and against the south of the Kenites." Now what does the word road mean? Direction. Because he's got south and south of different places. Okay, that's one guess. How about the word against? How are we to understand the word against? So it sounds like a battle. All right, so whither have you made a road today? Now, road is an English word we use today, but in 1611 it meant something different. Go to the next slide. A raid. Isn't that great? No, it's spelled correctly. So where is it that you go? If you're going to be looking up a word that's in the King James, an English word, and you want to know what the English meaning was back in the day, what do you go to do that? Oxford English Dictionary. You can't use a Merriam-Webster's. You can't use an American Collegiate Dictionary. You can't use any contemporary English dictionary. You got to use the Oxford English Dictionary. You might want to make a note. And that's where because they keep all of the former meanings. When you look at the Oxford English Dictionary, they'll tell you all of the meanings down through time and what they meant. And they will tell you if a word is obsolete, or if it's archaic, or when it changed its meaning. Okay? And the Oxford English Dictionary is a big, wide thing. You probably want to do it online, get it online. All right? So that covers formal equivalency, examples of formal equivalency, and an example of how context will give you some hints as to what a word means. And you can't just take the words for granted. I mean, when he says, where have you made a road today? That's a perfectly good question that we can understand. He's saying, did you get your paving machines and where did you carve out a road? Make a path. Well, that isn't what this verse says at all. He's saying, where did you make a raid today? Okay? All right, so let's go back to our study guide and let's begin. Part 1, a brief history of the Hebrew and Greek texts. So we have originally Old Testament writings. So this would be like the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy. That's called the Torah, and or the book of the law. And then you have the writings, which are Psalms, things like Esther and Psalms and Job and Proverbs and the writings. And then you had the prophets. And that was the Old Testament. What are the Apocrypha? Right. So these are books that the Jews had written in their history during their history, books that were revered, but they didn't consider them to be inspired. They didn't consider them to be Scripture. Anybody know of any books that are called Apocrypha? Can you name a couple? Maccabees? There's 3 books of Maccabees. Any others? What? Not Esther. Esdras. You're thinking of Esdras. First and second Esdras. Okay. One of my favorites is Bell and the Dragon. Just the title of it. Sounds kind of like a Marvel comic book type of thing, right? Bell and the Dragon. Sirach, the book Sirach. Who was Jeremiah's secretary? You know, remember his name? It's mentioned in the Bible. Starts with a B. His name is Baruch. So one of the apocryphal books is the book of Baruch. It's supposed to be the writings of the secretary of Jeremiah. And so there are others. And so the Old Testament Apocrypha were present when our Lord Jesus began his ministry on earth. The Old Testament canon was already established and represented in Hebrew, the original language of the Old Testament. In the 3rd century BC, this would be like in the 200s, like 270, a Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures was undertaken and produced in Alexandria, Egypt. Why? Why would somebody want a Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures in 270 BC? This tests your knowledge of history and culture. Because nobody understood Hebrew except the Jewish priests and scribes. The only language they spoke and everybody understood was Greek. Greek was the lingua franca of the 1st century. And that's a fancy Latin term that simply means the language of the people. And so this is the language of commerce. This is the language that everybody spoke. That's why the New Testament was written in Greek. And so a translation was needed of the Hebrew Scriptures. And Ptolemy, a king in Egypt, his name was Ptolemy Philadelphus, he sent an ambassage to the high priest in Jerusalem and said, we would like to have a copy and translated into Greek for our library here in Alexandria. And would you be so kind as to send an ambassage to us with the Scriptures, the Holy Scriptures, that we might translate these things? And there's a story, an elaborate story about how this all took place by a man named Aristeas. And it's worth reading. It's fun. And anyway, so they made this translation, and it was later referred to as the Septuagint, or LXX, which is Roman numerals for how much? 70. And this was ostensibly the title given because there were 70 or 72 translators involved in the translation of the Hebrew Scriptures into Greek. So we know it today as the LXX or the Septuagint. So if you see the LXX mentioned someplace in some notes in your study Bible or something, that's what it has reference to as the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament. Now, most but not all of the quotations of the Old Testament made by Christ in the Gospels and by the inspired writers of the New Testament were from the Septuagint. So wherever you see in your New Testament, and you're reading through your New Testament, and you see where Jesus or the disciples or the Apostle Paul quotes from the Old Testament, typically, most of the time, they're quoting from the Septuagint. Once in a while, they'll quote from the Hebrew Scriptures. When you get past the apostles and you're looking at the ancient fathers, the fathers of the generation that succeeded the apostles, people like Polycarp and Ignatius and Irenaeus and Tertullian and so forth, they all looked at the Old Testament, and when they had the Scriptures of the Old Testament, they were looking at the Septuagint. And we'll be learning more about the Septuagint. So most but not all the quotations were made by Christ and the inspired writers from the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. The other times they were from the Hebrew or Aramaic scriptures. So let's look now at the Greek Old Testament. Let's start with the Greek Old Testament. The Septuagint, sometimes referred to as the Old Greek. So when you're reading writings by some of the ancient fathers or the apostolic fathers, they'll talk about the Old Greek. This was the Old Greek version of the Septuagint. This would be the version that Jesus knew and the apostles knew. This is the Old Greek version that they understood as the Greek Old Testament. It went through 3 revisions or versions, beginning with a guy named Aquila. And it's not the same Aquila that we read about in the New Testament who's married to Priscilla. All right? It's not the same guy. And so he was a Jewish proselyte who in AD 126 published his version from the Hebrew that was modified to exclude renderings favored by Christians that applied to the Lord Jesus. So Aquila was a Jew. He was not a believing Jew, but he was a Jew who took the Septuagint and he erased from it references to Jesus that the Christians used to prove that Jesus was the Messiah. Is that a version of the Old Testament that you want? Now, of course, the Jews favored this version, right? Later in the 2nd century, an Ebionite named Symmachus published a new version that was translated from the Hebrew in good and pure Greek. And when we say good and pure Greek, this was good Greek. In other words, a grammatically correct, good vocabulary. It was like Luke's writings. Luke wrote in Greek, and he wrote in a really good Greek, and as opposed to Aquila. Later in the same century, another Ebionite named Theodotion published his version of the Septuagint, relying mostly on the Old Greek version, owing to his limited knowledge of Hebrew. So he wasn't quite as educated in Hebrew as Symmachus was, and so his translation relied more upon the Old Greek version and copied a lot of that translation. Symmachus made a whole new translation from the Hebrew scriptures that he had in his possession in his day. In the 3rd century, now we're in the 200s, Origen of Alexandria, and he lived from 185 to 253. An enterprising and learned scholar noticed that the various Greek versions differed from the Hebrew text and from each other. Origen was one of those rare people. He nerded out on all kinds of detail. You know anybody like that? Yeah, give me this. I knew it. Origen was a guy that he carefully looked at the scriptures. He compared scriptures that he had. He took the manuscripts that he had available, and he had quite a few available to him. And he went and he made a comparison. Here's what he found out. He said that they differed from the Hebrew text and from each other. So in an effort to assist the church in restoring the Septuagint to its original condition, he undertook to create his Hexapla. And that's what they called his book. It's a codex. Now, what is a codex? Is it a code book with a secret decoder ring? And a codex, here's a codex. Before, when they had writings, they had them in a scroll. You all familiar with a scroll? So you roll out the scroll and you read whatever it's on the scroll, and you keep rolling it out to get more and more information. Somebody figured out, in the New Testament times, somebody figured out, you know what we could do? We could write all this stuff on leaves, a leaf, and we can bind them all together with a binding, and they called that a codex. Now we have computers, and now we're back to scrolls. Right? Scroll up, scroll down. Yes. So and it would differ, but when you look at manuscripts in the codex form, it's like a book, and you can have Greek here, and then it continues on the next page, and then the next page, same thing. In Hebrew, it would start in the back of the book, and it would be right to left, here, and then here, and then keep going, right? And so that's what a codex is. It's no more, no less than just a book that we're accustomed to having on our bookshelf. So he put that into codex, and it was called the Hexapla. And it's a codex in which each page was divided into 6 columns. So this had to be pretty big if you're going to take a page, right, and you're going to put 6 columns in it. So each page, 6 columns. And so it had 6 columns, and there would be written in the first column the Hebrew text. So he would put down the Hebrew text in the first column. The second column had the Hebrew text expressed in Greek characters. And then the third column had the version of Aquila. And the fourth column had the version of Symmachus. And the fifth version, the Septuagint, the Old Greek. And in the sixth column, Theodotion. And he did that so you could compare. So that if you read both Hebrew and Greek, then you could make a comparison and see, well, here's what the Hebrew says, and here's what Theodosian's version says, here's what the Old Greek says, and so forth. And they called that Hexapla. We don't have a copy of the Hexapla today. We have portions of it that we have one. Most of what we have is in a translation, and we don't have all of it, but people referred to it a lot in the ancient writings, and it was very useful. The hexaplar text of the Septuagint has been best preserved in the Syriac versions. So the versions that I'm talking about are the Syriac versions, and that's where you get most of what we know about the hexapla. And only incomplete fragments in Greek remain. And that's all we have time for today, so let's button up, and we'll continue this, Lord willing, next week. All right, let's have the men remove themselves to Building 4, and we'll have our time of prayer together, and the ladies can stay here, and then we'll come back together and close our service.